Well, greetings, imagination connoisseurs. Once again, it is I, your sanctimoniously notorious RMB, here for Robservations live chat number 138. Who would have thought? Who would have thought? Now, before I do anything, there is a matter of business I must take care of. My moderator, Officer Jim Boyers, sent me a super chat yesterday. This is how you all know that I don't play favorites, or does anybody get special treatment? No, they don't. Even when they're working for me, doing a fine job of it as well, they still send me super chats. My moderator, Jim, and I didn't read it. I didn't see it. So I'm going to read his super chat right away because it weighed heavily on my conscience when it was pointed out to me that I did not read this. So this is from yesterday. Jim says, I've been busting my butt being a Rob fan, and he didn't invite me to his studio. Am I a little butthurt? No, I'm a lot butthurt. I've been Harloffed. You know what? Just so you know, Jim, if I'd seen that yesterday, I would have read it. Now that's very funny. As many of you know, there's been a little bit of controversy with the impresario of the Schmodown, Kristian Harloff, who didn't get invited to Star Wars Galaxy's Edge. Even the Mary Sue wrote an article about it where presumably they said he was mad or something because girl reporters got to go and he didn't. That's not what happened. But anyway, Kristian's a very good guy. He even does, yes, Harloff Minor is a planet in the Star Wars universe that's now it's canonical. I love Kristian. And you know what? I think he should have been invited to Galaxy's Edge. That's what I think. But if, perhaps online decorum, you shouldn't get butthurt about anything. But anyway, Jim, I thank you for that super chat. I thank you for being a fine moderator. And, sir, you used to be Officer Jim before you retired. And I thank you for your service. So cheers to Officer Jim. And I really appreciate his moderation skills. So welcome all of you imagination connoisseurs, you members of this, the Post-Geek Singularity community. It's a wonderful day today. It's Thursday afternoon. Looking around for things to talk about. One of my favorite franchises, James Bond. James Bond 25 is, of course, in production. They had a controlled explosion that they were testing, and it went a little bit awry and literally blew the roof off of a soundstage at Pinewood Studios. Now they're being investigated by the British Health and Human Services. I don't know what the equivalent is. DH. All I know is like DHSS from Wham Rap, from the first Wham album, George Michael. I don't know what happened, but it got me thinking about the Bond franchise. So that's kind of what I was thinking about today. But first of all, I want to give you all a recommendation. I want to draw some attention to something that's coming down the pike that no one is talking about, but it is awesome. There is a series of books. Well, it's a couple of books by Daniel O'Malley. The first of which is called The Rook. Now, this has been turned into a TV series. It involves superhuman powers and the Secret Service, all kinds of stuff. And the book series is great. And there is a TV series, and it seems to be flying underneath everyone's radar. So if I could implore you, all of you imagination connoisseurs, all of you members of this, the Post-Geek Singularity community, I would first of all recommend the book first. There's more than one in the series. And look up the trailer because it looks like it has a great cast, and it looks like a very faithful adaptation of the first book, actually. So very excited they're turning that into a series. Well, they did turn it into a series. Another thing I just want to bring up that irks me to no end, as everyone might have heard, the Swamp Thing television series that was on the DC Universe streaming service was canceled today after airing one episode. Now they're blaming it on North Carolina tax rebates or something. I think it's just the DC Universe app is probably in trouble. They'll fold it in to Warner, whatever their new streaming service is going to be. But it's really too bad. I have friends that work on that show. I have not watched it. I haven't quite got around to it. I didn't think the week it debuted I needed to watch it. To be honest, I watched all 3 episodes of the new season of Black Mirror, which I greatly enjoyed. It seemed like they pulled back to more of the stripped down versions of the earlier seasons. But after Bandersnatch, which I thought was a triumph earlier this year, and then, of course, or actually maybe very, very late last year, I'm not sure when it dropped, but these 3 episodes, pretty interesting. And especially for Pride weekend here in LA, everybody should take a gander at the Anthony Mackie episode of Black Mirror. It was quite interesting, and I thought pretty ballsy for 2 actors like that to take on such subject matter, but very interesting. It's called Striking Vipers. That was the first episode I watched. I watched the Miley Cyrus episode last night, which was kind of a hoot, and I enjoyed it very much. So anyway, folks, let me just throw on the glasses real quick because my eyes are tired, and I got letters for you. I got all kinds of letters, one of which is what brought me to the topic at hand. But anyway, this one comes from Colin Norris. Colin, thank you for writing in. Hey, Rob, I've enjoyed listening to you ever since I heard you on Movie Moan. Now, wow, that has taken me back. The Movie Moan podcast, Phil G. That's a long time ago. Superman Returns is one of my favorite films. The story, the score, Brandon Routh's fantastic and subtle performance. I could go on and on. My question is, since you were in the unique position of working on the film, could you tell me what the deal is with Lois having his child, but not seeming to know Superman is actually Clark Kent? How is it possible they've been intimate and she doesn't know that? The idea of it as a literal sequel to Superman 2 and her memory therefore being wiped doesn't work because she doesn't seem surprised to find out Jason is Superman's son. I'm guessing that they wanted to have their cake and eat it too, with having the child, but also the fun of Lois not knowing his identity. It's my one head scratcher with the movie. Also, do you know if Singer had any plans for a sequel and what they might have been? Is it true Jude Law was considered for Zod? Thanks for reading. I so enjoy your show and your well thought out commentary, especially on all things Trek. Well, Colin, first of all, thank you for that. By the way, these glasses are fogging up because it's finally hot here in Southern California, which is great. Here's the thing. The way I looked upon it, I think the writers, Mike and Dan, and then Brian himself, thought that because indeed it was supposed to be a sequel to Superman 2, that Superman famously does kiss Lois and she forgets. But I think she could put 2 and 2 together after Superman left to look for Krypton, that she had to resolve herself to the fact that he was gone, and then she met Richard White. And I think she was sort of in denial because even though her mind was wiped, people don't forget that. Ultimately, there's a sense of what was going on. At least that's what I would consider. Now, I'll tell you something what's very funny. I saw on a website the other day, last week, that they were talking about the unmade sequel to Superman Returns, and they detailed the story. The story of the unmade sequel of Superman Returns that they detailed on this website, and I forget, it was my story. It was the sequel that I had come up with, not the sequel. There's actually a sequel script to Superman Returns that Mike and Dan wrote that I actually have a copy of. But the sequel that I came up with was about Brainiac, and it's a long story, but if you find that video, remember the sequel they describe is not one that was developed by Brian. It was one Brian and I talked about the summer after Superman Returns came out, but it never reached anything other than a couple of conversations I had with Brian. By the way, my idea was good. I think it could have worked. But I really appreciate that you asked. And I wish I had a better answer for you. And I don't know the name. I think the name of the Mike and Dan script, the sequel script to Superman Returns, was in fact Man of Steel, if I remember correctly. Anyway, I guess I'm going to put these glasses back on once again. This next one comes from James Holiday. Greetings, Mr. Burnett. If you happen to read this on your show, you know what? I just realized that James asked me to keep him anonymous. So James, I'm going to save this and read it when no one knows it's your name. So I can't read that. Sometimes I get people's letters and I believe it or not, I don't read them first, like today, because I came back from John Campy's show a little late. So James Holiday, I will read your letter later when I can keep you anonymous as requested. So I apologize for that. This next one comes from Aaron Brown. Hey, Rob, love your show and the John Campia show. You've made a passing comment, however, that keeps bothering me. It typically comes about when a listener sends in something about toxic fandom, and you will usually say something like, pop culture is a luxury. We're not running away from predators on the African veldt. I get what you mean. Pop culture is a luxury, but it also seems to imply no one cares about silly stories when you're trying to survive. We know, however, that they actually cared a great deal about stories back on the veldt, and we are still mining the oral traditions of our collective past to turn into pop culture blockbusters. I personally imagine Zeke pacing next to the fire and spinning a tale while most of the tribe sits in attentive silence. Meanwhile, Nork is shaking his head and mumbling, totally not canon. I'm just having a bit of fun and intentionally being obtuse to your passing comment, but stories have always been important to us, and it isn't bad that we disagree, even passionately disagree about stories. We just shouldn't be toxic about it. That is the main thing I see with your Star Trek rants. You are passionate about the subject matter, which of course is appropriate and necessary to a discerning fandom, but not in a toxic way. Unless you're a Discovery writer. Take care. Keep up the great work on the show. Well, Aaron Brown, first of all, thank you. That is a very cogent and important point to make. I think you're right. I think stories have absolutely always been important to mankind. It's how we've defined our lives. I'm sure every time somebody went out onto the African veldt and had a successful hunt, they came back and told the entire every detail down to the littlest, the tiniest minutia of how that hunt went. And I believe that storytelling in all of its myriad forms is the most potent way that we can convey information to one another, how we feel about one another, how we feel about the world around us. That's what storytelling is. I think it is to make sense of our world. And I think by recounting whether it was a hunt, whether it was a failed romance, whether it was something you strive for and failed to achieve, whatever it is, all stories are trying to make sense of the great human truths of life. Yes, even the pot boilers or the bodice rippers or whatever it is you're reading, horror novels, science fiction, all of it is to try and make sense of our finite existences and to convey those truths and hopefully make life worth living. I think a life without storytelling and a life without being a storyteller and a life without listening to stories is a dark life indeed, because at its very essence, what storytelling is doing is helping all of us, both the teller of the tale and the audience members listening. They're trying to make sense of human life, our existence. And that's what the very basis of storytelling is. And I agree with you. I mean, when I say toxic, though, here's the thing. What I find distressing about the modern day is that we're now arguing over how good the stories actually are. I mean, it's funny. I guess because I'm probably older than many of the viewers of this channel. When I grew up, say, watching, well, the James Bond franchise or like the Planet of the Apes franchise, it was always an exercise in diminishing returns. So when you're a kid, when I was growing up in the 70s, it was not infrequent to see a Go Ape marathon on your local independent station. They would usually show over 5 days the 5 original Planet of the Apes movies: Planet of the Apes, Beneath the Planet of the Apes, Escape from the Planet of the Apes, Conquest of the Planet of the Apes, and Battle for the Planet of the Apes. I mean, these were movies. Oh, the dogs are here. These were movies that I loved, but clearly the first Planet of the Apes is the masterstroke, and then there's diminishing returns. Although there's I think delights to be had in all of them, even when you get to Battle for the Planet of the Apes. And by the way, if you get it on Blu-ray, Conquest of the Planet of the Apes has the R-rated, more violent, reactionary, revolutionary cut of the film, which is a far better version of the movie. So I highly recommend that. And the Bond franchise is all hit and miss. Now it feels like if there's any franchise film that that falls down on the job and lets everybody down. It's like a national disaster. And Last Jedi has caused many people to lose their religion, being Star Wars. And it seems odd in my mind. I would say, well, maybe episode 9 will be better. I didn't like Force Awakens. I liked Last Jedi more. I thought Force Awakens was a meandering sort of mess of a film that was just a cover band playing Star Wars greatest hits badly. And what happened to Han Solo was inexcusable. And there's a petulant child using a lightsaber in a spaceship to smash control panels. I was out, man. I'm like, what is this, Michigas? Didn't like it. And I did like Last Jedi more. But so, do I think Last Jedi is a perfect movie? No, I think it's a little goofy. But hey, I still enjoyed it. I really liked where Luke's story went. Unexpected, interesting, perhaps not as satisfying as some people might want it to be, but I did enjoy it. So I really wanted to read James Halliday's letter, but he wanted me to keep him anonymous, and I'm going to respect that, James. So thank you for sending me your letter. And I've noticed that people have sent me in a few more chats, and to keep that all rolling, I am going to look at where we're at there. So I will do that because I don't want to miss anyone's super chat. If you're going to support the channel, you deserve to be heard live and loud. So let's see. We are at Factual Opinion. Sent in. Should Warner Brothers focus making animated movies for the giant monster universe? Godzilla 2 is underperforming. I assume Godzilla versus Kong will be the last. Well, what's interesting, if you haven't, there's an animated Godzilla film that has been released in parts on Netflix that I actually quite enjoyed. Different take on Godzilla than we've ever seen. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, maybe. Look, I think people want to see Godzilla. I just maintain that giant monsters, Godzilla's form of giant monsters, Pacific Rim, same thing. I don't think American or Western audiences embrace the whimsy that is inherent in a lot of Asian science fiction. And the idea of King Kong, Beauty Tamed the Beast, we can believe in that because King Kong is not totally unplausible. And ultimately the story of a misunderstood beast that comes to man's world and pays the horrible ultimate price and yet falls in love while doing it. That's something we can understand. But, a 300 or a 300-foot tall Jaeger or a 300-foot tall kaiju and like Godzilla, that strains credulity to the fragile Western mind, especially the American mind that grew up. I mean, our myths are Westerns, or World War II soldiers. And we don't have, it's kind of like ghost stories. Like we don't necessarily believe in ghost stories, but if you live in Japan, the reason movies like Ju-on, The Grudge, or even things like The Ring work is because in Japan, everyone knows your ancestors are watching you all the time. They're judging you all the time. And if you do something bad in a house, the house is cursed. You don't get absolved of your sins. There's no Yom Kippur. You don't get to like have a Day of Atonement. No. If you cause something to happen that leaves unclean spirits in a house or somewhere, they're gonna stick around and they're gonna take out their wrath against you. We don't have that in this country. We don't. We believe in what did Hans Gruber say? Roy Rogers, Marshall Dillon, cowboy. That's what we believe in. We don't believe in those kinds of things. We also don't believe in 300-foot tall giant monsters, and we know they could never exist. If they're insects, somehow we believed in those for a while. But we don't believe in giant monsters ultimately. So it doesn't matter. So our filmmakers are faced with a choice. You either try and make the concept of kaiju monsters palatable and realistic. You go down that realistic route like Godzilla 2014 did, or you embrace the whimsy. You embrace the sort of the unrealistic nature of the idea of the kaiju franchise. And you do what Mike Dougherty did in Godzilla King of the Monsters. And, a lot of people complained about the human story and they liked the monsters, or they didn't think there even was enough of the monsters in Godzilla King of the Monsters. But it's a hard road to travel down. And like, I thought Kong Skull Island was pretty good because what did we have in there? We had the American military. It was a Vietnam War movie, also set on Monster Island, on Skull Island. pretty genius premise myself, or I thought myself. I thought it was great. But yeah, it's just a different thing. I don't think maybe animated is the way to go, but in America, unless you're looking at a Pixar movie or a Disney movie, I don't know if animation is going to help. Although I did really enjoy the animation that's on Netflix now. I thought that was really cool. Mark C says, R.I.P. Rest in peace, Swamp Thing. Warner Brothers used the Roundup on you way too early. Very nice reference, by the way, Mark C. Unbelievable to me that Swamp Thing, which by all accounts is a pretty stellar show, was canceled after one episode on a streaming service. How crazy is that? And then they're blaming it on tax rebates? I don't know, man. Why don't they wait and see? You got James Wan, who's the executive producer of that show, who just made you $1 billion. I thought that whole thing was a little weird, but yes, I'm disappointed. I haven't even got around to Swamp Thing yet. I was going to subscribe to DC Universe so I could watch Doom Patrol, Titans, and Swamp Thing, and now it's like, well, wait a minute. That's too bad, and it's gone. I'm never going to see it. Willow Yang says, I still haven't seen Free Enterprise yet. Is there a particular version or cut that you'd recommend, and where can I purchase it? Why, yes, Willow, there is. The version that exists on Amazon is 4:3. It's cropped. It's not my preferred version of the film. It doesn't have a particularly great sound mix. It was something that was done in 1999, and it's in standard def. I think that Free Enterprise is grainy. It's delightfully grainy because it was shot on film. Kodak Vision stocks to be accurate. But my preferred version of the movie is the 5-year extended edition version of the film that Anchor Bay released on DVD in 2006. So the Anchor Bay version is my preferred version. It's got a new transfer. It's got extra scenes. It's got better special features. It's got a better sound mix. But you used to be able to get that DVD pretty cheap from Amazon. But it is the Anchor Bay version. All the other versions that are out are not the Anchor Bay version. They're not the longer version. The original version of the movie was 113 minutes long. You need the longer version of the film. So get that version, Willow. I would send you one, but I don't have any more copies. They're all gone. I've given them all away. I have my Free Enterprise was one of the last laser discs that were ever produced, and I'm very happy about that. But hopefully I will be able to do what I'm calling, somebody's here. If I could get my hands on the negative for Free Enterprise and had enough money to restore it, and it's going to cost about $225,000 to $250,000 to do an entire restoration of the film, remix the sound. Hey, dude, what is up with you? What's up with you? What's up with these running dogs? Why are you barking? Why is it that I can't go on? I need an office because every time I go on, somebody comes over here. Hey, stop it, buddy. Come on, dude. Come here. Why? Somebody always comes over here when I'm on my show. And that's why the dogs bark, is because they don't know who's here. But it's always invariably while I'm on the show. But anyway, yes. I mean, I would like to purchase the negative from my executive producer, my very generous producer, Mark Otwald. But the movie's basically been sitting on a shelf since 2006. And I'd like to do what I'm going to call the Final Frontier cut. Not the final cut, but the Final Frontier cut. And I would love to do it in 4K. One day I'll figure out how to raise that money. We'll see. Maybe. But until then, the Anchor Bay version that has been out of print since 2006 is the best version of the movie to get. Miguel Valdez says, hey, Rob, what do you think of the petition to get Infinity War Endgame Blu-ray IMAX edition released? Well, now that's a petition I can get behind. I think most fan petitions are ridiculous. I think why not? Look, anybody who sets up one of those petitions, if you're of age and you're not registered to vote, you shouldn't be signing those kinds of petitions. However, I could get behind an Infinity War Endgame Blu-ray IMAX edition release. I think Disney really dropped the ball. I think the Russo brothers, as much as I love them, really dropped the ball. Take a page out of Warner Brothers playbook, and when a film has an IMAX aspect ratio, you just cut to the IMAX aspect ratio. I remember, I think the first time I saw that was on the Dark Knight Blu-ray, and I was like, man, this is awesome. It's not obtrusive at all, and I honestly prefer the IMAX aspect ratio on both Infinity War and Endgame. They were shot in that aspect ratio, and I think they absolutely should be seen that way. So, yes, sir. Bring it on. But, the problem is putting a petition out isn't really, I think, effective. What you need to do is write Disney Home or Buena Vista Home Entertainment, Walt Disney Home Video, whatever it is now. I don't know what the name of it is. So let's write them and complain. But you know what? The problem is they don't care about physical media. Their Atmos mixes have been lacking. They're like moving. They're looking toward the future, which is streaming. I've often said how much that bums me out. But I think physical media deserves that IMAX ratio. Why not do it? Alexa M, by the way, thank you for being here and supporting the channel. Alexa M says, had an argument with a friend saying, done with Batman because it's been done to death and they never do better than what Kevin Conroy and the Nolan films did. Well, Alexa, I don't necessarily disagree with you. I think that the Batman films, I really enjoyed Christopher Nolan's Batman trilogy. And as much as The Dark Knight Rises is a deeply flawed film, I really enjoy how, if you watch that now, the first hour is all character setup. I really enjoy it because it feels so adult. But, they've got to do something like, I love even the Batman comics. I still read many Batman comics, but it wasn't until I was sort of bored of Batman until I read the Court of Owls storyline. What, about 10 years ago? When did that first come out? I do have the absolute version of it, which I think is great. But yeah, I don't disagree with you. Anyway, now on to the main event, or at least the main event letter. And I think I'm going to put these glasses on again. I really liked this letter. I thought it was interesting. It's a long one, and it comes from someone who has written to me before, but it just struck me. Look, I got this letter the same time I heard about whatever the Department of Health is in England going after the producers of Bond to see why this explosion happened. By the way, they were testing an effect, and it blew out part of the wall and the ceiling of a soundstage, the roof of a soundstage. So, it happens. But one person was had minor injuries because debris from the wall landed on them. So anyway, here it comes from Roberto Suarez. Dear Rob, I've been meaning to write with a follow-up to a topic you discussed recently in your Mary Poppins Returns episode. It is in regards to a question that came up about James Bond continuity. The way I've made the film series work is by acknowledging that the Bond franchise has been retconned 4 times. This requires slightly altering the order of the films to make these continuities work. The first continuity is the Connery Era. These span all of the Connery films and requires that On Her Majesty's Secret Service and Diamonds Are Forever be swapped in their order of release. The films in this era begin with Dr. No and end with Diamonds Are Forever, skipping On Her Majesty's Secret Service. Taken as a whole, they encapsulate a pretty cohesive narrative in which Bond's main nemesis, Blofeld, begins as a behind-the-scenes operative and From Russia with Love, is revealed and confronted by Bond in You Only Live Twice, and after going through plastic surgery and requiring some doppelgangers, is finally dealt with in Diamonds Are Forever. I actually really like that. The reason the order of On Her Majesty's Secret Service must be swapped with Diamonds comes from several problems with the Blofeld-Bond relationship. Based on release order, after Bond meets Blofeld for the first time in You Only Live Twice, he meets him once again for the first time in On Her Majesty's Secret Service. Blofeld also kills Bond's wife, Teresa, at the end of On Her Majesty's Secret Service, and yet this is never acknowledged when Bond confronts Blofeld again in Diamonds. Well, I just want to point out that at the beginning of Diamonds Are Forever, Bond is on the hunt for Blofeld. Where is Blofeld? It's a big deal. He's hunting Blofeld because of what happened in On Her Majesty's Secret Service. But that doesn't mean I don't like your machete order here. By placing Diamonds right after You Only Live Twice, the conflict with both Blofeld and the Connery era is more consistent and fluid. With these 2 titles swapped in order, we can transition toward the first retcon of the Bond series with the beginning of the Teresa era. This is the longest of the continuities, spanning the George Lazenby-led On Her Majesty's Secret Service, the Roger Moore films, From Live and Let Die to A View to a Kill, and the Timothy Dalton films, The Living Daylights and License to Kill. Lazenby's Bond at the beginning of On Her Majesty's Secret Service has experienced some of the same adventures Connery experienced, but somewhat time-shifted and adjusted to this new version of the character. This is why we see him early on in the film revisiting his past as he rummages through the gadgets from his previous adventures. Through all these movies, Bond's marriage to Teresa De Vincenzo and her death is a loose yet acknowledged thread. It begins with Bond's marriage to Teresa in On Her Majesty's Secret Service and her subsequent killing by Blofeld. The next time we see Bond in this order, he is drowning his sorrows with other women at the beginning of Live and Let Die, where Moneypenny pays him a visit somewhat worried for him. Later on in The Spy Who Loved Me, Bond is apprehensive about discussing his marriage with Agent XXX as they share a drink at an Egyptian bar. For Your Eyes Only begins with Bond visiting Teresa's gravesite and confronting Blofeld one final time as he dumps him and his wheelchair down a chimney. Lastly, Felix Leiter recalls Bond's tragic marriage in a scene preceding his own wedding and License to Kill, and Bond then goes rogue, driven towards avenging Felix's own tragic marriage, which in many ways parallels his own. The next era is the Brosnan era, covering the 4 movies in which Pierce Brosnan played the title role. This Bond, like Lazenby before him, has experienced some of the same adventures of his predecessors, though somewhat time-shifted to align with his age. In a similar scene to the one in On Her Majesty's Secret Service, Brosnan's Bond finds some old gadgets that are part of this history, such as Rosa Klebb's knife shoe while visiting Q and Die Another Day, and GoldenEye does acknowledge that he has been married or at least has had a significant relationship that impacted him dearly. The final era is, of course, the Craig era, which is the most clear attempt at an actual retcon and which tries to follow a more serialized continuity. The movie begins with Bond initiated into the 00 program and kicks off the new continuity with the story that started it all in the novel series Casino Royale, updated to the mid-2000s. Quantum of Solace is a direct continuation of the story, picking up minutes after the end of Casino, and though Skyfall seems to follow a more procedural approach by not clearly acknowledging the previous 2 films, Spectre brings all 4 films back into alignment within a structured though muddled continuity. My guess is that Bond 25 will finish out this final arc, leading to a 5th reboot of the series once Craig steps down from the role. The peripheral supporting roles, such as M, Q, and Moneypenny, don't really align with these continuities. The way I see them, at every point in which the series was retconned, these characters were retconned as well, even though they were sometimes played by the same actor. So, for example, the character of M in the Craig era is a retcon of the same character in the Brosnan era, even though they're both played by Judi Dench. Thank you for taking the time to read this and indulging my passion for the Bond franchise. Bond was my first fandom, and it provided a way for me to connect with my father, who is also a huge fan. Now a father myself, I've begun to share these films with my son in the same way my father did with me. Take care, Roberto Suarez, Puerto Geekian on Twitter and Instagram. I love that name, Puerto Geekian. Well, Roberto, I have to say, I love this idea. I mean, the Bond franchise always has had this sort of weird continuity, not unlike the Godzilla franchise, but the Godzilla franchise continuity has different names, like the Millennium series and then the Japanese names, the Heisei, can't pronounce it. But the Godzilla series is similar to that. And I've always thought there's, of course, the old belief that the James Bond moniker is the name they give every 007. There's not a real man named James Bond. That's a made-up name that they give, they hang once you get your 007 name or your license to kill, then you get the name. You get the name James Bond, which is why there's been so many James Bonds over the years. And I like that, but there's this desire to add this continuity. Everybody wants to have a continuity to the Bond films. And they've never really bothered me because I've always seen the Bond franchise as being sort of, it is of its time, as people have pointed out. I mean, it really is. Some Bond films are, what's funny is, and I've talked about this before, people don't remember that after World War II, America, the whole world retreated and tried to lick their wounds and clean things up. But in America, you had this era of prosperity in the 50s that gave way to the middle class. We had a lot of government regulation. There was the GI Bill. A lot of money was put into infrastructure in this country and schooling. And and people had it good. People were tired of the early part of the 20th century, where there was the World War I, World War II, all kinds of craziness. And so what sprung out of the 50s and sort of this bougie, which by the way, I love bougie. I love the word bougie, coming from bourgeois or bourgeoisie. I love that. But the idea of the Bond franchise, which was really, that came out of the whole idea of spy fiction and the Cold War and the Playboy lifestyle and all of that. Indeed, Bond was a favorite of Hugh Hefner and John F. Kennedy. So when the movies showed up in the early 60s, when Dr. No debuted, most people hadn't flown around on transcontinental jets. Most people certainly didn't go to the places James Bond went. There wasn't a lot of travel happening for normal, everyday people. And now we were almost 20 years away from the end of World War II. And there was all kinds of change on the horizon. Even in the early 60s, the French were already in Indochina, and America was getting involved, and the 60s, the way we know them, were about to explode. But the Bond franchise showed people a glimpse of a life that they didn't have at the time. And it was groundbreaking. You know, you could watch Elvis movies, Viva Las Vegas, and those clam bake and all those kinds of movies. But it was the Bond franchise that I think was the ultimate wish fulfillment of all of the men that came back from World War II and started families and became the middle class. And, they'd been married and raising kids for 10 years. And between Hugh Hefner's Playboy lifestyle that was showed us in the magazines and the Playboy clubs and all that, it was James Bond who captured a zeitgeist moment. It was the ultimate male wish fulfillment fantasy. And that was a big deal. And so all through the 60s, you had Dr. No, you had From Russia with Love, you had Goldfinger, you had Thunderball, you had You Only Live Twice. Then Connery left the series. Lazenby was brought on for his one film in 69 for Her Majesty's Secret Service. Connery came back in 71 to star in Diamonds Are Forever. And then we didn't see Sean Connery as James Bond until the Kevin McClory produced remake of Thunderball, Never Say Never Again, which came out the same year as Octopussy. I too am a big Bond fan. So the question that I have is Bond, the James Bond character, was really a character of the 50s and 60s. I mean, that's where he really, his origins came from. I mean, he was a hard drinking, womanizing, take no prisoners, I will kill any motherfucker that gets in front of me. He was a worldly man who was dangerous, and he knew everything. He knew what temperature to order the right champagne at. He knew what kind of caviar to eat at which hotel around the world. I mean, the question that I have, and I often wonder about this, is I think that ever since the 60s, Bond has been looking for an identity. The character of Bond is irresistible. You can always put the character of James Bond in a 2-hour movie. You always can. In the 70s, they brought Roger Moore in, who'd famously been the Saint. He was a lot less rough and tumble, far more urbane as Bond. He was a very handsome man, not ruggedly handsome like Connery, but more of a, an English lord. I don't know. He was a really handsome guy, but I never believed that the Roger Moore Bond would get in the same scraps that Connery was. He was infantry, whereas the Roger Moore Bond seemed more like he was behind the lines calling the shots. It was just a different Bond. It was a different time. The 70s were very different, and we were no longer in the Mad Men era. Things were changing. Women's liberation. There was bra burnings. And of course, famously, we saw in Spy Who Loved Me, with the introduction of Barbara Bach's Major Anya Amasova, Bond's equal in every way, even though she was a woman. It was pretty ballsy in 1977 to introduce that character in Spy Who Loved Me. But I think Bond had sort of, as much as Spy Who Loved Me was the first Bond film I saw in the theater, as much as I love the Bond franchise, and as much as I love seeing Spy Who Loved Me, I think that ever since Bond left the 60s, even now, what they've tried to do is capture the cultural zeitgeist the way Bond did in the 60s, but they've never achieved it. Don't get me wrong. I loved every James Bond movie. I get excited for every James Bond movie, but James Bond does not have the cultural resonance his zenith was in the 60s. Now, I'm not saying that there's not joys to be had in Live and Let Die and Man with the Golden Gun. Or those, admittedly, those are few. Same with Diamonds Are Forever. Bond got very much reinvigorated with Spy Who Loved Me. I'm a Moonraker apologist. I know it's goofy, but it's grand. It's sci-fi. It came out the same year as Alien. It followed and Star Trek: The Motion Picture and The Black Hole, following on the footsteps of Star Wars. And then the Bond franchise sort of reset for the 80s. I think the For Your Eyes Only, beginning with the Sheena Easton title song, where she's actually singing in the opening credits. You bring back Cool Lotus Esprits. It's very much an 80s movie, sort of a precursor to things like Miami Vice. And then Bond was following Miami Vice, copying Miami Vice when you finally got to 1989's License to Kill. I mean, Bond has never been, even now, as much as I like Casino Royale, because it's another movie out of time, in the era of Bourne, Bond seems a little kind of stale. As much as I might have liked Skyfall was a little, I didn't like Skyfall. Did I say I liked Skyfall? As much as I wanted to like Skyfall, I didn't like Skyfall. It seemed like a low-rent Dark Knight, and it was annoying, and it made not a lick of sense, and it was a movie where James Bond completely failed, and I didn't like that. Gilbert, why are you barking? It's funny. Those two. What can I do? I guess they're part of the show. But so I've always believed that the James Bond franchise, as much as I like the films, and I own them all on Blu-ray, and I'll probably buy them on 4K because I've bought James Bond movies just as many times as I've bought Star Wars. I just think that it might be time to say goodbye to the James Bond franchise for a while, unless they reinvent it for the modern age. I don't think they really have. I don't think the world that we live in now, the Bond. Hey, what is your problem? Come here. You come here. Come up here. Come up here, dude. Yeah, you both come up here. Stop yelling. Stop barking. You're yelling. You don't have to bark. Please don't bark. I know you guys are barking. I don't know why they're. Oh, come on, dude. I don't know why they're barking. But anyway, that's kind of how I feel about the James Bond franchise. And I love the Bond franchise. Gilbert, please. Come on, dude. Come on, buddy. I think someone's out in the backyard having a conversation. I never know. There's teenage girls here. Elizabeth's here. I need an office. I need a door I can close where these dogs can't get to. Now, somebody would say, put them in the backyard. That won't work either. You would hear them barking. Listen, Gilbert does not like it when people are here that he doesn't know. Listen to that. Hey, buddy. You want a cookie? Come here. Come here, Gilbert. I'll give you a cookie. Come over here. Come on, dude. Come here. Come up. Okay, well, are you going to stop barking for the people? Will you? You promise you'll stop barking, huh? Huh? You got to be a good boy, huh? Here, buddy. All right, have another one. Want another one? All right. Are you going to stop barking? I'll give you a third one if you don't bark anymore. Huh? Yes. Yeah, sure. Come on, dude. You don't have to be scared. Everything's good. With your bark, people will run. They'll run cowering in terror from you. He's like a dog kaiju, that one. But, so anyway, the Bond franchise. What can I say? That's how I feel about it. I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong. What do you guys think? What do you guys think of the James Bond franchise? Is it still relevant? Can it be relevant in this day and age? I don't know. I really don't know. As much as I love the character, I still believe in that globe-trotting, womanizing secret agent that I've always loved, that travels around the world, that knows the perfect temperature of champagne and knows every piece of artwork and knows every fish that he sees in an aquarium. And I wonder, in this day and age, especially now, in the hashtag Me Too era, and everybody having, you know what I think the funny thing about James Bond, and this is the way I've always thought about him ultimately, is I've always thought of James Bond being better than me. James Bond is the ultimate alpha male, and if you're a dude, if you're a guy, I want to be James Bond. And I've accepted the fact that I will never be as cool as James Bond. I'll never be as smart or as knowledgeable as James Bond or as resourceful as Bond. He's the ultimate male wish fulfillment figure. But as the idea of masculinity, I mean, heck, masculinity in itself is now being deemed toxic, which I think is sort of strange. I mean, how can you do that? I think everybody can be toxic. I've met many. I've seen a lot of toxic femininity in my life as well. But it's funny because in this day and age, you know, you can't. I don't think anyone said it better than M herself, that he was a sexist, misogynist dinosaur, a relic of the Cold War. That's what Judi Dench said in Goldeneye, and I think that's true. And I think that I love James Bond sticking around, but he is a relic of the Cold War. And he is indeed a sexist, misogynist dinosaur. But isn't that why we love him? I know that's why I love Bond. I'd rather have the world. I'd like to have a James Bond on saving the world, even though we might not like him anymore and we might not know he's there. I'm certainly glad he is and saving all of our lives. Alexa M is back. Alexa M says, your argument with John over the guy who will never vote for an Avengers film. I'm on your side. You were right. John was 100% wrong and annoyed me. Well, Alexa, first of all, thank you. Thank you. I appreciate you saying that. But here's the thing. I don't, you know, when we're having these kinds of conversations, I think that, and by the way, let's point out that Ashley as well. I thought Ashley was also correct in that she points out when you read somebody, and I stand by this. I think there are, you know, it's funny. I use the word ghettoized genre. I say ghettoized genre a lot, and everyone thinks I'm being some kind of like a racist in America. But when I think of ghettos, I think of the Jewish ghettos in Europe. That's the first thing that I think of when I think of a ghettoized genre, is that there are movies that were rounded up and put into ghettos because the intelligentsia didn't want to appreciate that they existed. So when I use the word, when I say the term ghettoized, that genre has been ghettoized, that's what I'm thinking about. So anyway, I think that, look, I've said this before, science fiction, fantasy, horror are genre, now the superhero genre, are genres that are never going to be taken seriously by the critical establishment. It's changing, but ultimately there's a group of people that immediately equate superheroes with children, that comic books are for children. I think that's a very American attitude, because if you go to Asian countries or like France, certainly the comic art form was never considered just for kids. But the way it developed in America, it really was disposable. You know, it wasn't considered necessarily artistic, even though drawings were involved. It's and superheroes were the predominant form of comic storytelling in the United States, which isn't true in Asia and in Europe. There's comic books about golfers in Japan. So I think that there's a whole group of people that won't necessarily vote for an Avengers movie because all they're seeing is the fact that, oh, it's a superhero film, as if Endgame and Infinity War, and indeed the 22 movies that now make up the Marvel Cinematic Universe, were somehow easy to make. They were not easy to make. And the fact that people cared as much about people did not go to see Avengers Infinity War and Avengers Endgame as many times as they did, and those movies didn't make as much money as they did because a bunch of dumbed down people wanted to go see superheroes beating up on each other. No, they went and saw those movies because, first of all, those movies are first and foremost about characters that people love. What is my Burnett axiom? Never put your universe before your characters. Well, the MCU never did that. They always put their characters before their universe. Sure, some people would say that maybe Iron Man 2 or the Thor the Dark World suffered from being incorporated into the MCU or having to follow along in those footsteps, or, you know, whatever. But I disagree. I think the reason the MCU works is because they've done a wonderful job casting actors to embody those characters and give them stories and screenplays that immediately endear those characters to us. And that's why we love them. And that's really hard to do when you're making a movie, making characters that people love. It's a hard thing to do. It is not easy in the least. And to get people as involved as they were in Infinity War, hell, I was, as a middle-aged man with one foot in his grave, I was completely enamored of those movies, and they were really well done. And it's unfortunate that I think that, of course, people will there's not everybody, but there's a group of people that believe that comic book movies are somehow beneath them. And I would say that superheroes are just another genre, the same way that Westerns are a genre, or that film noir is a genre, or romance is a genre, horror, science fiction genres. The superhero genre is sort of our new Western, our new cops and robbers movie. And you can equate something like a movie like Logan is the Unforgiven of comic book movies, maybe, if you wanted to look at it that way. But I think a lot of people don't. I mean, Black Panther got a pass. John pointed out that the same guy who was quoted did, in fact, vote for Black Panther as a Best Picture candidate. And I'm like, really? That's a little odd, considering he made that statement about the Avengers. I wouldn't have thought that he would do something like that. But, he did. But again, I still think that people are really not, they're not ready to accept superheroes yet. But more movies like Logan, they might. Unfortunately, who knows where that will wind up? I don't know. But yeah, I think John, it was interesting because when I went into the office today to do John's show, he wanted to point out to me that guy who we were arguing over said that he would never vote for an Avengers film, but he did actually go and vote for Black Panther. Well, I didn't know that. That wasn't how it was presented to us. And I would still say that anybody who just writes off an Avengers movie and says he would never vote for an Avengers movie for Best Picture, why would you say something like that? I've learned in my life that you should never make those kinds of statements because you never know where we're going to be or what's going to happen. Things change all the time. Fashions change. And the James Bond franchise certainly has become, I think in the 70s, it was a lot less relevant than it was in the 60s. I think in the wake of, say, the Bourne movies, Bond with Casino Royale and Skyfall became more relevant in this day and age. I don't know where Bond is going to go now. I think the real problem is that the world, we no longer have romantic enemies to fight, which is sort of interesting. I mean, the greatest threats to our world, whether it's, well, if it's ISIS or it's Islamic fundamentalism, if it's North Korea, if it's Iran, whoever poses those threats to us, they are not sexy anymore. Going after them, you can't go to Montenegro and have a showdown against a terrorist by playing cards with millions of dollars to buy in people like Mads Mikkelsen in beautifully tailored suits. I mean, the world, the villains of the world are no longer sexy, unfortunately. And perhaps that's me being a culturalist. But that's what even the villains in the Bond movies were always interesting. I mean, Auric Goldfinger, he loved gold. That was his deal. He was a rich dude that loved gold. He was crazy, but he golfed. I mean, Auric Goldfinger golfed. I mean, one of the great scenes in Goldfinger that people forget is that Goldfinger cheated golfing. And Bond he one-ups him by cheating when he golfs. I mean, that's some amazing stuff that you would never see today. I mean, I would love to see, look, I love my ski sequences in the Bond films, but you wouldn't see Bond golfing, which is kind of too bad. That bums me out. I wish that we would see a Bond film where they golfed or skied again. I mean, even skiing. When does Inspector Bond was in the snow, but he never strapped on skis? I mean, is that because nobody skis anymore? Like, I grew up, skiing was one of the coolest things you could do. I grew up, I'm a skier. I grew up a skier. I love skiing. And yet, when was a Bond skied in World Is Not Enough? That was a long time ago. I think that was the last time we had a ski sequence in a Bond movie. And that was a little slow. And that was almost 20 years ago? Where's the ski sequences in the Bond films? I don't know. However, I look at stuff like this book, The Rook. It combines supernatural and secret agents, and we'll see. I don't know. What do you guys think? Are you Bond fans? Do you still think Bond is relevant? I don't know. We shall see. The Wolverine says he said he voted for the cultural significance of Black Panther. See, I don't think when you're voting in the Oscar category, you shouldn't be voting for cultural significance. You should be voting for the artistry of cinema. And lots of movies have cultural significance, and that's not to take away from the representation that Black Panther made par for the course as part of what it did, and it was amazing. It was amazing what Black Panther did, but I don't think as a movie it was a Best Picture nomination. I really didn't. I call me crazy, but voting for something's cultural significance doesn't make it a Best Picture. You can have cultural significance and have a riveting film. Look, I've told people famously that I didn't want to go see Gandhi when it came out. I'm like 3 hours about Mahatma Gandhi. I was in junior high or high school when it came out, and I'm like, I don't want to go see that. But it was a significant film, and I saw every movie that came out back then. So I went. Gandhi swept me away. I was swept away. One of my favorite movies when I was a kid, which deals with racial issues, was Ragtime. If you guys haven't seen the movie Ragtime, I loved Ragtime. I don't think it's out on Blu-ray. I haven't seen Ragtime in ages. I'd love to see Ragtime. I thought Ragtime was a genius movie, and it's it had cultural significance too, but it didn't deserve to win the Academy Award simply because of that. I really liked Ragtime. It came out in 81, and Milos Forman, who directed One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest and later Amadeus, directed Ragtime, and I really liked that film a great deal. It was nominated for Best Actress, Music, Cinematography, Direction, Writing, Costume Design, and Howard Rollins for Actor in a Supporting Role. And it says it didn't win any, unfortunately. But what a great film. Christmas Day of that was probably our Jewish movie day of 1981. I'm sure that's what we went to see, because I did see it in the theater and I was blown away. Loved it. Anyway, yeah, that's kind of what I wanted to say about James Bond. What are you guys saying in what's going on in the super chats here? Stub McShave says, do you think we'll see secret Lairs again in Bond? Well, we kind of did in Spectre, but it was lame, which really sort of bummed me out. I mean, I was bummed out by that. I mean, Bond had great Lairs, the volcano lair in You Only Live Twice, the Leparis, the tanker in Spy Love Me that opens up and can swallow 3 nuclear submarines. Of course, the orbiting space platform in Moonraker. What a great lair. But you know what? Bond villains were kind of back then larger than life. I mean, sure, you had Spectre and you had Smersh. But when they gave you the megalomaniacs, I mean, Spectre with Blofeld went full-on science fiction when he was stealing capsules out of the sky in You Only Live Twice. One of the great lairs in any movie, that volcano base, even though it was a little silly. But we didn't have SpaceX rockets that could land again the way those rockets could, but it was awesome. Who didn't love that? Piz Gloria, Blofeld's hideaway in On Her Majesty's Secret Service, where you had to take a chairlift, or actually a cable car to get there. You could ski down. It was great. Another great ski sequence. Willy Bogner action. That was all great. Scaramanga's weird island base in The Man with the Golden Gun. I mean, all that stuff was awesome. I missed that, but that was sort of that fantasy element that we're missing. Like, how do you accurately portray a villain with that kind of a lair? Unless he's a tech magnet, you could probably do that. But I think it'd be really hard to make that work. But again, that's just me. I could be wrong. But I would love to see more. I'd love to see a full-on megalomaniac bent on world destruction. Somebody like I really liked Sam Jackson's character in the first Kingsman movie. I thought he was right. I wanted him to win. Climate change and eliminating. Look, most of the people on this planet, humanity could, a big culling, if 90% of humanity was eliminated from the planet, it might be a little sad for the first couple of years, but you know what? 20 or 30 years on, people will be like, that was the best thing that ever happened to the planet. So I don't know, maybe a megalomaniacal genius like that, a cross between Steve Jobs or Bill Gates with also the charisma of a Mads Mikkelsen and somebody like well, I don't know, any of the great Bond villains. Get Sean Bean to come back and play another Bond villain. I don't know. But I think it would be great to do that. I think the Bond franchise needs to have that fantasy element injected back into it. Maybe they've got that in Bond 25. I've heard it's about genetic engineering or something. I would love to see that be the case because, man, we need Bond as escapism now. He's been brought way too down to earth in the last 2 decades, at least in my opinion. Suja says, your favorite Alfred Hitchcock movie. My favorite Alfred Hitchcock movie is Rear Window. I love Rear Window mostly because I think Grace Kelly in that movie is, and Jimmy Stewart, but Grace Kelly is one of the most incredible characters that's ever appeared on the screen in any movie. I dearly, dearly, dearly love Rear Window. I love it so much. I think it's great. But I also love other Hitchcock movies. I mean, I love Vertigo. I think I like Rope more than a lot of people. I love the 39 Steps, The Lady Vanishes. There's just there's so many Hitchcock movies that I like, but Rear Window is my favorite of all of them. And yeah, but mostly because of Grace Kelly's character. But I also like the whole idea of voyeurism. I think that's the way it's handled is great because we all are voyeurs. And the way that we're put into we as the audience member are turned into voyeurs by watching the film. We want to know what happens to the neighbors as much as the characters in the film do. And it's really genius how it works. Roberto Suarez is here, who wrote the Bond letter. What about classic Bond? What about a classic Bond TV series following the original books and set in the original time period? Look, as we saw what Brian Fuller did with Thomas Harris's Hannibal Lecter books. When you look at the Hannibal Lecter books, Red Dragon, Silence of the Lambs, Hannibal, and Hannibal Rising, if you look what he did, he reinvented those books, reinvented the mythology, changed the sex of some of the characters, but he did a really great job of re-examining those books and reinventing the relationships by going in and giving a modern spin, even though he didn't have the rights to Silence of the Lambs yet. I think that's a great idea. A period show set in the 60s, go back to the Cold War, because what's great about that is even if you go back into the past, if it's a period piece, audiences are able to then disassociate themselves from today. It's different. The whole vibe is different. So I think a Bond, of course, it would be expensive. And I think the perfect example of what it could be is if you look at the Man from U.N.C.L.E. movie. I loved the Man from U.N.C.L.E. movie. It's not a perfect movie, but the evocation of the period is tremendous. And I liked Henry Cavill as Napoleon Solo and Armie Hammer as Ilya Kuryakin. I loved all that. I thought it was great. I think that's a great idea, Roberto, doing a Bond series Bond set in the 60s is amazing. And, we've seen how that can work with like shows like Killing Eve, which is amazing. Two characters becoming obsessed with each other. I think something like that would be great. But following the books could be very, very cool because, of course, the books are very different. Moonraker is a very different book than the movie, of course. They didn't go into space to a space station on American space shuttles in that movie. Rakanman85 says, Rob, I am super upset about the Swamp Thing cancellation. I agree with you. I think that a lot of people are super upset about the Swamp Thing cancellation. I am too. After one showing, and now they're blaming it on tax credits. That's why it's canceled. Why not wait until the run is over? Why do you have to announce that? I thought it was super disrespectful to the creative staff. It's not like necessarily unless they're going to release their ratings. I mean, if the ratings were tanking, but I think the entire DC Universe streaming service, it bums me out. I thought it was handled poorly. Stub McShave says, thoughts on the Bond spoofing in Austin Powers. I loved Austin Powers. I didn't like The Spy Who Shagged Me so much, but I love the first Austin Powers, and I thought Goldmember was definitely a return to form. Look, and Casino Royale, the 67 Bond spoof Casino Royale with Woody Allen and David Niven, and Even that is fun to watch. I don't mind spoofing the Bond franchise at all if it's done well. I mean, Kingsman, the first Kingsman especially, is kind of a Bond spoof, and I dig it. I think it's cool. AJ Lancaster sent me in a super chat. Thanks for supporting the channel, AJ. Appreciate that. But you didn't have a question. I assume you were thinking about James Bond, though. But yeah, I do think that spoofing something is not a problem for me. I think it becomes a problem like with The Simpsons, because they've spoofed so many things. I think most people nowadays have seen Simpsons parodies than those people have seen the actual movies or programs that The Simpsons was in fact spoofing. And it's a bummer. I think it's a bummer when spoofs then supplant the real thing. So when you actually go back and watch the real thing, it's tough for audiences that are new to this material to approach it and watch it and give it any kind of consideration, which is bums me out. I mean, so many things that I like, the original Planet of the Apes, which I love so much. I love Soylent Green and all these things that have been parodied to death sometimes. But the Austin Powers movies, as much as they do have an element of being a Bond parody, there's a lot of other 60s films that they also parody in a way, like Matt Helm, for instance, Modesty Blaze, things like that. There's a lot of other, Our Man Flint, for instance. There's a lot of other 60s genre films, spy movies that those Austin Power movies draw upon. And I think that's cool. But I do love them. The first Austin Powers it's great. What's not to love about Austin Powers? Yeah, baby. Yeah. So yeah. I love those things. Let's see. What do you got? What does anybody have to say here? Milton Bradley says, I stopped watching The Simpsons. Christian Garcia says, Rob, you didn't answer the Jude Law question. I'm curious about that too. I read that Brian wanted him to play Zod in Superman Returns, but Zod died in Superman 2. Yeah, you know what? I never heard that. I never heard that maybe Brian said that. I don't know the answer to that. I can't speak to that. I love Jude Law. I'm a huge Jude Law fan. If I could be anybody, I'd want to be Jude Law, especially if I could live in the talented Mr. Ripley time and be the heir to be the scion of a fortune, of a shipping magnate's fortune, and I could sing Americano, and play the saxophone in jazz clubs in Italy. Man, that would be the life. And I love Jude Law and Gattaca. It's funny. AI is on Netflix, and I was drifting off to sleep, and I was like, wow, I haven't seen AI in a long time. And I've always liked AI a lot because, of course, it was going to be Kubrick's film, and Spielberg took over and directed it. But I forgot how good he was as Gigolo Joe when he gives that speech. It's great. I'm a huge Jude Law fan. Love Jude Law. But I don't know. Playing Zod, having Jude Law played Zod, that would have been really, really interesting. I would like to have seen that. Dieter Bastian says, hey, Rob, did you get your Demon Lover Blu-ray from the UK? Have you watched it yesterday? Cool movie. Didn't know anything about it. Funny you say that, Dieter. This showed up today, as a matter of fact, from the Arrow Demon Lover disc, Oliver Assisias' movie, and it stars Connie Nielsen. I've not watched it. I'm going to watch it today. I'm glad you liked it. That's interesting. But I'm looking forward to it. Leo Corbello Film says Barbara Bach was made fun of in the behind the scenes of The Spy Who Loved Me for keeping her accent off camera during production, even though that's what most actors do. Well, her accent was pretty funny. One of the great Bond beauties. I mean, there's no wonder Ringo Starr married Barbara Bach. I mean, she is unbelievable and by the way, Caroline Munro, one of the most, as far as my mind goes, Caroline Munro, one of the most beautiful women in terms of her presence. Boy, do I love Caroline Munro. Love her to death as she played Naomi. I believe she was dubbed in the film, actually. AJ Lancaster comes back and says, unrelated, Brightburn worked for me as a reimagining of The Omen. That's really interesting. I haven't seen Brightburn yet. I need to go see it. People have liked, I've heard very mixed things about Brightburn, which really makes me curious about seeing it. I really want to see it. Frack off Felger Carb. That is very Battlestar Galactica. Hollywood faces a crisis of talent and originality. Well, I don't think Hollywood faces a crisis of talent or originality. I think the problem is movies have become so expensive to make that you have to hedge your bets by making films and spending money on content that is risk-free, as risk-averse as possible. So there's not a lot of new things. Hopefully, even though Dune is, of course, a reimagining and a not a reboot, it's just another adaptation of Frank Herbert's seminal science fiction novel Dune. We'll see if Dune works. Maybe they'll look toward literary franchises more for movies. But I think we're getting a lot of stuff that's original. It just seems like when we watch franchise properties or superhero movies that we might not be getting stuff, but there's a lot of original stuff in theaters these days, and I'm feeling pretty good about it. So yeah. Oh, Terry Flynn says Oral Knots and Ninja Panda are the best skits on Star Wars. I now prefer them to the Family Guy ones. Okay, if you guys don't know the Oral Knots, and that's AURALNAUTS, the Oral Knots, I've been loving the Oral Knots for years and years and years and years and years. They even did a parody of that new, what is it, Scene 38? If you've seen that Obi-Wan Kenobi, Darth Vader fight that those guys redid from A New Hope, they did a parody of those guys doing that. That's how hip those dudes are. I love the Oral Knots. All of their Star Wars movies. They did Freestyle Bane. Do you know who it was who had beaten me in freestyle? Only me. Yes, only you. If you guys haven't seen Freestyle, if you want to know who the Oral Knots are, go to YouTube and look up Freestyle Bane and just watch it. Everything you need to know about them is contained in that. They're some of my favorite YouTubers. Their humor is so cutting edge, and a lot of people, aren't that into it, but it's pretty amazing. They're great. Rakanman85 says, watched 4K Batman last night. Just amazing. Yeah, it looks amazing. How'd you feel about the new sound mix? Did the new gunfire bother you? It wouldn't bother me, but I was curious what you think. Yeah, everyone says it looks amazing. Bill Hunt said it looked amazing. Stubble McShave says it could be interesting with a Felix Leiter FBI series. Movie Bond could guest star in some episodes. I think a Felix Leiter episode would be, or a TV series would be great. I love Jeffrey Wright as Felix Leiter. He was great. I love how he calls James Bond brother, because everybody in the service calls each other, if you're in the intelligence services, you call each other brother. I love that. I think that's awesome. That's a really good idea. Milton Bradley says Caveman had Barbara Bach in a fur bikini, so it wasn't all bad. Caveman's a little rough, though, to be honest. A little rough. Well, everyone, I think I'm going to bring this chat to a close. I want to thank you all for being here. I want to remind everyone that this chat is brought to you by Lucky Tiger Men's Grooming Products for those men who want to look good and feel great. I myself, of course, always love their facial scrub and their all-over body wash. And if you love their products, you should love their products. Or if you haven't tried their products, try their products. You can go to getluckytiger.com. And when you check out, punch in PGS for this, the Post-Geek Singularity community. If you punch in PGS for all of my audience members, you get 20% off your order. So thank you for Lucky Tiger for continuing to sponsor these shows. I want to thank you, the imagination connoisseurs of the Post-Geek Singularity community, for all of your support via Super Chats or however you're supporting the channel. Go to the website, theburnettwork.net. Send me letters. You can support the channel here, and you can support the entire. You can become a member of the Post-Geek Singularity on my website for $1 a year. $1 a year. And now that Mike Bawden is back, I'm going to put a Post-Geek Singularity t-shirt up just in time for summer on my website. It's black with a white logo. It's very cool. And it's in microgramma, one of my favorite fonts of all time. So how great is that? I want to thank my moderators. I want to thank Jim, and I want to thank Terry for moderating you, all of you ne'er-do-wells. And I will be back tomorrow at noon for an epic extra long chat. So send me some letters if you want to. I'll read them all. We'll talk about something else. And again, thanks for being here. And if I could get you all to like these chats. If you like them, just hit like, because YouTube analytics now have changed, and those likes are important, and also subscriptions. If you would like to subscribe to the channel, that would be most appreciated. So I want to thank you all very much. And as always, I will tell you, every person you meet has a story to tell that you have yet to hear. All you have to do is listen. And with that, I say, have a better day. And thanks for being a part of Robservations, the show about something.